Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Our guest this week is Max More. Max is a philosopher, a futurist, and a transhumanist, a term which he coined in 1990, the same year that he legally changed his name from O'Connor to More. One of the tenets of transhumanism is that technology will allow us to prevent and reverse the aging process. And in the meantime, we can preserve our brains with a process known as cryonics. In 1995, Max was awarded a PhD for a thesis on the nature of death, and from 2010 to 2020, he was CEO of Alcor, the world's biggest cryonics organization. Max is firmly optimistic about our future prospects and wary of any attempts to impede or regulate the development of technologies which can enhance or augment us. Max, thank you for joining the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
It's a real pleasure indeed, Max.
Max, what was it that first got you thinking about the amazing future that technology could give to humans? For me, it was reading Ray Kurzweil's Age of Spiritual Machines in 1999. How about you?
Well, yeah, I get asked that question quite often, and I still don't have a great answer for it. There wasn't any one thing that I could point to. I often sort of half joke that there may be a gene or a set of genes for neophilia, because from a very early age, I was fascinated by space to begin with. From the age of 5, watching the Apollo 11 landing. And I certainly can't explain it environmentally. Nobody around me was interested in any of these ideas. But it seems like I always had an interest in overcoming limits, beginning with space, and then really into life extension in my early teens, which seems kind of strange. So I can't really point to one source. So even before I was reading a whole lot of science fiction, like Heinlein, I read a lot of when I was about 16 or 17, but it was even before then. Now, I can think of certain influences. Pearson and Shaw's book, 1983, I read Life Extension, A Practical Scientific Approach when I was 17, but I was already pro-life extension by then, so I'm not quite sure where that came from. There were books like Jerry Pournelle's The Endless Frontier and A Step Farther Out, which I read around 1984. Adrian Berry's book, which probably nobody's heard of, called The Next 10,000 Years. Jonathan Glover's book in 1987, What Sort of People Should There Be? Interesting book. I actually had him as my tutor at Oxford. He was the only professor who I agreed with at all. And then Alan Harrington, 1982, his book The Immortalist. Godlesher Barker read in 82, followed by The Mind's Eye the next year. 1984 was pretty important, reading Julian Simon, The Ultimate Resource, which gave me a real sense of resources are not really scarce, and it really depends on human ingenuity. So that was pretty important. Really, after I was already thinking this way, there was a newsletter called Claustrophobia, which was put out in the early to mid-80s. That actually was like a proto-extraby in a sense. It covered space migration, intelligence increased, life extension. That's probably fairly obscure now, but it was quite interesting. Then in 85, I read Ettinger's book, The Prospect of Immortality, The Man into Superman, Mind Children by Moravec. So all of those fed into it. I went through a kind of religious experimentation period between like ages of 10 and 15 or so, where I tried out a lot of different belief systems. I'm especially interested in psychic phenomena. So I actually spent time in Bristol going around dowsing and spinning pendulums and all that kind of thing. But as I thought about it, I became increasingly skeptical that any of this stuff worked. But I think what the appeal was the idea of doing something beyond the natural human limit. And this seemed to be a way that you could do that. Unfortunately, it just doesn't really work out as far as I can tell. So then, being interested in space, obviously brought an interest in science. So I guess I thought more about how science and technology could actually help to do these things, like something about lifespan and getting off the planet and hoping to make us a little bit more smart. So it was really a lot of different sources, probably reading from early on. Yeah, it's almost like there was a gene. I'm only half joking. Maybe there really is some kind of cluster of genes that predisposes people to an open view of the future.
Well, we should find out what these genes are and somehow spread them more into people's biochemistry.
You want to spike the water supply, David? For a lot of people, it's science fiction that gets them into these ideas. But for you, obviously, you turned straight to the non-fiction at quite an early age.
Yeah, I was really a voracious reader. I keep a list of my reading, and it's kind of unbelievable now how many books I got through by my teens and early 20s. I can't imagine reading like 50 books a year, serious books. But I couldn't stop reading. My mother was constantly taking me to the bookstore, and I just had like a voracious appetite. Yeah, science fiction came on fairly early, but I think I was kind of drawn to that for its view of things, and it wasn't really the inspiration so much. One thing I've mentioned before with regard to cryonics, this is pretty interesting. It was a British TV series called Time Slip. I must have been about, very young. I'm trying to think, like before my teens. You can actually get this now, I think, on YouTube or some other means. They re-released it. It was about this young boy and girl who would go through this rift in space and time and have these adventures. The second story was about this Arctic research base where the commander had had an accident and he was cryopreserved. And then they had this artificial intelligence, which was kind of like more fluid biological kind of sophisticated in a way. They also had intelligence increase drugs. This was pretty amazing for a children's TV show in the early 70s. So that also probably sparked off some thinking as well. It was definitely the first time I heard about cryonics.
I remember watching that too and vividly enjoying it. I couldn't hardly wait until the next episode would come out to see how the story would continue.
Yes.
So back in the 1980s and the early 1990s, when you and Nick Bostrom and Anders Sandberg and Eliezer Yudkowsky and others started thinking about transhumanism, the internet existed, but the web didn't. And you were communicating by obscure media like Usenet. It must have seemed a bit like the Wild West. Are you nostalgic about those days at all?
Well, kind of. I actually started earlier than that. Well, there's a newsletter I produced back in England in 1985-86 called Biostasis, which no longer exists, unfortunately. I can't find any copies. But it was really a proto-extropy. It wasn't just on cryonics. We were talking about Mike Price writing about grand visions of space and lots of other things. So transhumanism was already in my mind before there was a word for it, back in 85-86. It was only later when Nick Bostrom came along, I think 1998, he started the WTA and so on. So it was already pretty well developed. But yeah, those early days with dial-ups and the connection sound is kind of interesting to think about those. The incredibly narrow window we had into other people's thoughts, just a bit of text on the screen, often crashing. But it really kind of focused people because now we have so much multimedia and so many ways of interacting that people don't focus very well. Back then, we were intently focused on these very in-depth discussions with some very interesting people, Marvin Minsky, Eric Drexler. We started at, 1991, I think, one of the very first lists discussing anything serious. So yeah, I am kind of nostalgic for the brain power of that group that we had at that time and the really tight focus on the ideas without any distractions. But I'm also kind of nostalgic, I guess, maybe more from the 1980s in a sense. It seems to me that was a decade when there was a real sense of possibility. The economy was doing well, decoding the genome, stocks were going up, everything felt pretty good. There was a sense that we were actually maybe getting towards the singularity at that point. And then, of course, things went downhill for quite a while after that. That was a pleasant time. It was also the time when I moved from England to California and was able to interact with more people interested in these ideas. So I'm definitely nostalgic for that. Back then, of course, California was a place where you really think of as a bright beacon. Today, although it's still strong in information technology and AI, I don't see it so much that way. It's going downhill economically, relatively speaking, and there's a lot of problems there. So I am kind of nostalgic for the California of the late 80s, early 90s.
Whatever you think about California's economy and the way it's run, it is ground zero for AI still, isn't it? And related technologies.
Yeah, very much so, yeah.
And whenever I go there, I'm struck by how much more time people there spend thinking about the future, certainly than they do in England. I think that gap is widening. Do you think that people outside California and perhaps outside the US generally should and could be persuaded to reflect more about the future and in particular about the amazing benefits that technology is going to give us?
Well, yes and no. A lot of the thinking about the future seems to be very pessimistic, very apocalyptic, focusing on catastrophes. So there's kind of a downside if people think too much about the future, given the way they tend to focus. Given the trends in our culture where we seem to amplify that even more today, the worst news gets magnified, the most extreme claims are the one that gets the most attention. Not the upside extreme claims, but the downside ones, because, the old phrase, if it bleeds, it leads, still works very much today, even more so. So, I'm a little bit ambiguous there, because if it's more thinking about the downsides, if we have more and more institutes focusing on how AI is going to kill us and other existential threats, I'm not sure that's a good thing. Actually, it may lead to more pushback against these technologies. Yeah, I'd definitely like to see more thinking about the positives. And it's nice to see that progress study seems to be taking off a little bit now. There are more people interested in actually thinking about progress and the conditions for it and in correcting the understanding of what the actual trends are. People really focus on the existing problems, which of course are real. But as Hans Rosling said, things can be bad in getting better. People focus on the bad bit and not on the getting better bit. And so they get a very defeatist attitude. So if we could think more about the positives and counter these cultural trends and psychological propensities to focus on downsides, that would be great. You can just think about all the disaster predictions we've seen over the years. There's some nice lists of them on the internet. Just all these things, failed apocalyptic predictions. It's very hard to get people to shift from that to actually thinking in a more positive direction. I think more critical thinking would be great. And unfortunately, schools don't really teach that. I taught a bit of critical thinking for undergraduates, but I found my students would come in with no concept of what an argument was. They thought it was the same thing as an assertion. They don't really think critically. They don't think very creatively either. I think we need critical and creative thinking. We need the critical thinking to tell us what is the bullshit, and there's plenty of bullshit in the futurism community as well, but also to think creatively. What are the real possibilities? What is the consensus? What do the authorities say? And how can we question that in a responsible way? So I think if we had more futurist education in the sense of critical creative thinking, thinking positively, questioning things, that would be a very good thing. But none of it means more and more focus on the negatives.
Yeah, I think this is really important. I mean, if people just carry on doing what most people are doing and not thinking about the future at all, then they're going to continually be surprised by giant leaps. You know, when GPT-4 comes out, everybody has a collective fit of hysteria. Then they get over it until the next one. That can't be good.
No.
And you're quite right. The general tenor of most conversation about the future is that it's bad and getting worse, which is just patently nonsense. The world is in a better state today than it has been ever. And unless we mess it up, technology is going to make it better and better. It is a job to get the culture to change like that. But if it doesn't change like that, we're going to be in a lot of trouble because big decisions will have to be made. And if everybody is either not paying attention to the future or just pessimistic about the future, then bad decisions will be made, and worst case, people will panic. And panic is very dangerous.
A good example of that, where it's particularly important, is on longevity. Right now, certainly in the US and in Europe as well, we're facing the problem of population peaking and aging, even more so in some other countries. And people are really not thinking ahead. Of course, politicians don't want to think ahead because they're afraid if they say, well, we have to do something about Social Security, we're going to maybe start raising the retirement age or phasing it out for younger people. That's absolute death in politics. But the amount of debt is just going up and up. The system is unsustainable. And that's a classic example of refusing, actually, not just failing, but refusing to think about the future. And I think it's important for us to try and get people to think about the longevity dividend idea, that if we extend healthy lifespans, then these issues will shrink. The problem is the aging population, where they're aging because they're infirm, and we spend a vast amount towards the last few years of life. So if we can get people to think about the possibility of extending healthy lifespan and how that could help the problem and how we have to start taking measures now, that's obviously a very important area where we need to think more about the future.
So a case in point about the need to be more optimistic and clear-sighted about the future is you spent a decade running Alcor, the leading cryopreservation facility, and that's got about 2,000 members and about 230 patients preserved. And those are kind of disappointingly small numbers, really, and it's probably because of attitudes like the one in Alcor's Wikipedia entry, where it says cryonics is regarded with skepticism within the scientific community and has been characterized as quackery and pseudoscience. Do you have some short, compelling responses to comments like that?
No, I'm joking. I do. I actually wrote a piece very recently for not my extropic blogs one, but the Biostasis Technologies website on this claim of pseudoscience and looking at the Wikipedia entry in particular. Wikipedia is a great resource for non-controversial topics, but I think it's disastrous on anything that's controversial. It gets captured by certain editors. You can't really edit it. So it's not at all an objective view on controversial issues. This quackery claim, it's usually by lazy people who haven't actually looked into the issues. And I've had this problem with even very smart people, bioethicists like Jonathan Marino. I've debated recently Arthur Kaplan, who's made some other silly comments, uninformed comments. The physics guy was Michio Kaku, who did a YouTube video on why cryonics doesn't make any sense, which I did a rebuttal for. They come in with various assumptions, like they seem to assume, for instance, once you go below freezing, ice is going to just blow up the cells. So they don't even bother to do the research. In fact, if they thought about it for 2 seconds, they'd realize that couldn't be right, because how could we have cryopreserved embryos, sperms, eggs, skin cells, corneas? We routinely cryopreserve lots of tissues and then reverse that quite successfully. So it can't be that simple. In fact, it's not even true that cells will expand and blow up. That's not what happens. They tend to dehydrate. Ice forms between the cells rather than inside them. And the real problem is not the ice itself. It's really the increasing concentration of the solutes inside the cells. Now, these are all things, obviously, we can deal with. A few decades ago, to say that we could actually take sperm, eggs, and embryos and cryopreserve them at incredibly low temperatures and then bring them back would be considered, well, that would be quackery, surely, but we do that today. So why was that not quackery? And I always like to use the analogy of talking about space travel, say back in 1900 or 1890. If you talked about that then, apart from Jules Verne and a few people, that would be considered just pure science fiction. But the difference between that and real pure science fiction is that you can show that there's no physical reason why it could not be done. There's no laws of physics preventing that. It's simply a matter of extrapolating technological changes. And usually it comes from the argument from lack of imagination. Well, I can't think how you do that, so it's impossible. Unfortunately, if you reduce it down, that's the basic thinking pattern in many cases. Think about 1890 or 1900, how are we going to build a rocket that big? How are we going to build life supports and computing systems? That's obviously impossible because I can't imagine how we can do it. And yet, a few decades later, we did it. So I think it's the same thing with the idea of cryonics, life extension in general. Just because someone can't imagine how it can be done, there's no argument that it won't be done. And in fact, there is positive arguments as to why it should be possible. So again, pointing at the evidence of all the tissues we do cryopreserve today, the fact that we're making clear progress over the years and that recently there's been repeatable successes in cryopreserving mammalian organs. And once we can do that, how can you say that we'll never cryopreserve reversibly a human brain? That seems to be a huge leap there from the actual successes we're having. So I would argue that cryonics is based on real scientific foundations in cryobiology and technology. The most speculative part, obviously, is the suggestion that we will be able to reverse that damage in the future using something like medical nanotechnology. That's clearly the most speculative because we don't have a lot of proof of that. But again, we can show progress in the area of nanotechnology. We can also show some pretty good theoretical designs like Robert Fletus has done in his work on nanomedicine. And again, point out there's nothing violating laws of physics so long as we have actually preserved the brain sufficiently well that we can infer the structure that was there from what remains. In principle, that should be repairable. It's not quackery, it's not pseudoscience, it is speculative, yes, because you can't avoid speculating about the future. And if we didn't, we'd never actually achieve anything because we'd just stick with what we think we can do today. And so this boundary between science and pseudoscience is actually less clear than when people think. You can think about the alchemists, for instance. You could say, well, that was pseudoscience, but, well, that's a bit of a rough characterization. These people are actually decent scientists given the lack of real scientific method at the time. They actually ended up creating chemistry, and some of their work actually did bridge over into real solid science. So it's not that clear. There's also a problem of consensus and authority here, that people on these controversial questions will immediately run to a proclaimed authority who may not actually be an appropriate authority because they may be an expert in one area, like Kaku is a physics expert. Cryobiologists know only about cryobiology. They don't know about nanotechnology or AI or anything like that. So there's often an appeal to a higher power of consensus and authority that can be deeply misleading. And I think also there's a failure to distinguish between process and conclusion in pseudoscience. So conclusion might sound like pseudoscience, and in some cases could be, depending on how you get to that conclusion. So if you just say, here magic happens and technology will do anything, that's pseudoscience. But you look at cryonics, we don't talk about mythical entities like cryons to explain things. We don't use pseudoscientific theories. We use real scientific entities and then extrapolate from there. So I think it's really just a lazy way of dismissing a very exciting possibility. And by doing that, of course, it's guaranteeing death to a lot of people. So it's a particularly good reason to be a little bit cautious in declaring to be pseudoscience.
Could you say a bit more about the preservation of mammalian organs?
Yeah, so there's been work at 21st Century Medicine in California, originally working on rabbit kidneys. That was really interesting, but was hard to reproduce. And there were various reasons why there was difficulties. The one company that made a certain compound went out of business in Japan. They lost their microsurgeon, but they kind of got back on board with that. So there's some successes there with rabbit kidneys. But then more recently, last year at University of Minnesota, they actually repeatedly were able to cryopreserve rat kidneys, rewarm them, reimplant them, and have them function. So it wasn't just a one-time thing, it was repeatable. And of course, there's a massive possibility beyond cryonics here. There are many, many people, tens of thousands of people dying every year because they cannot get a tissue match for an organ. It's very hard to get an organ, send it maybe thousands of miles across the country and get it to someone who needs it. But if we could actually reversibly cryobank organs, we could save a lot of lives. And the kind of technology we need to do that, which is very mainstream research going on in many places, obviously is going to apply to cryonics as well. So yeah, we've made increasing progress from single cells to clusters of cells and now to actual organs. And there's no particular reason why we should not continue that progress. One of the main problems also has been the rewarming issue, that rather paradoxically sounding, when you rewarm tissue from cryogenic temperatures, you can get recrystallization. It seems strange that crystals would form as you warm up, but that can happen. And there's a certain range in which that's difficult. So you have to rewarm very rapidly. But there's been increasing success with that using various radio frequency techniques and nano warming, where you put iron nanoparticles in the fluid and that helps to warm it up more evenly. There's work going on that in Spain and various other areas. It's been slower than I like because it hasn't had enough funding, but it seems like more funding is going through this area. There's obvious mainstream applications. So I think we're going to see increasing success, more repeating of those experiments, and hopefully human organ cryopreservation and organ banking. And that'll make it increasingly hard for people to say that cryonics is just a wish fulfillment or a dream.
Yeah, it does seem a bit absurd to say that cryonics could never work. That does seem daft. And you acknowledge that we don't have the technology and may well not have the technology for quite a long time to recover the brain back into a working state. But what do you think might prove to people that it is possible today to preserve the brain in as faithful a condition as makes it really very likely that it would be recoverable in the future? What's the gold standard for that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Some of this has already been done. It's just not really well publicized. In cryonics, quite steadily at Alcor and also at Tomorrow Biostasis in Europe, in many cases, people are CT scanned. The brain's a CT scan, and we can show how well we've actually cryoprotected the brain, which reduces ice formation. However, that doesn't really show you anything that's going on at the neural level and inside the neurons. But then you can do electron microscope studies. You can do differential scanning calorimetry, which tells you what kind of elements you have in there, if it's the right kind of stuff. So we need a lot more of those kind of studies. But the Brain Preservation Foundation, with its prize, had some very good submissions that showed, in the case of Robert McIntyre's work, which is basically combining cryopreservation and chemical fixation, that on the electron microscope, the ultrastructure scale, there was extremely good preservation. There's also a paper in the works, which has been in the works for too long, by Gregory Fay on a particular Alcor case, Dr. Stephen Coles, who was kind of a special case. We took brain samples, and based on the talk that Greg has given, the results were spectacularly good. It looks like not just the neural connections, but the neural bodies inside are extremely well preserved. It was a fairly good case. It was fairly good conditions. That should push people, but will it? I'm not sure. It's amazing how people are resistant to the actual evidence. I think one thing that could be really interesting, this suggestion hasn't been put into practice yet, but someone looked at neuroscientists who took some brain tissue and hooked it up to basically a flight simulator, and they were able to demonstrate that the brain tissue could be trained to do the flight simulation, some very basic flight simulation stuff. Well, that would be really interesting if you could take brain tissue, train the brain tissue on something like a flight simulator or some other task, which requires some real knowledge of how to do it, cryopreserve it, rewarm it, then test it again. If you could show not just that there was coherent electrical activity, which we've been able to show for a long time since the Suter experiments, if you could show that, that would be pretty compelling evidence that you've retained the brain structure needed for cognition. I think the original researcher that died, so we need to find someone who can actually do that study, and I think that will be pretty compelling evidence. But I'm not actually super optimistic that people will pay any attention to the good evidence. It seems like one area where people are in denial, I think for strong psychological reasons. Until we can show some real certainty, basically maybe bring someone back, a lot of people may still hold out till then because they can't face the ambiguity of the uncertainty that may or may not work. They want to guarantee it. Otherwise, they'd rather cling to either a religious belief that they're going to go to an afterlife with certainty, or the humanistic view that death is actually good for you and gives meaning to your life. It's very hard for people to abandon those psychological defense mechanisms without being certain of something else to put in their place. So I'm a little bit pessimistic that evidence itself will do anything until we actually bring people back. But if we can bring back animals, whole dogs and so on, that should definitely have a big impact. But that may be a little while still.
Different people have different motivations. There are some people who are just in denial and have persuaded themselves that death is a good thing and gives meaning to life because the whole idea is frightening. They don't want to think about it at all. But there's another group of people, and I have to declare an interest, both David and I are in it, which is people who are guilty of cryocrastination. We think that cryopreservation is better than the alternative, which is just straightforward death. But there's various reasons, money, plausibility, current level of the technology, means we're procrastinating and cryocrastinating. I would think that people like us would be moved by incontrovertible evidence that a brain can be preserved in a state which means it really should be recoverable. And as far as I understand it, we're not there yet. I mean, you can definitely do it with plastination, but the only way to recover that is by uploading the brain. You can't recover the brain as a functioning organ.
Well, maybe it requires some pretty sophisticated nanotech to undo all those bonds, but it's more difficult, certainly.
The question is, how long before you have this smoking gun that will persuade David and me to stop cryocrastinating?
I don't know. I mean, again, it depends on the funding. There already is some pretty good evidence, as I said. Hopefully when this paper on Steve Cole's case comes out, you find that fairly compelling. So hopefully very soon. But it needs to be obviously more than one paper and more than one case. It needs to be repeated. It really depends on the funding. And that's why I recently, along with Ashwin de Wolf and Emil Kenzior in Europe, have founded the Biostasis Development Fund, the sole goal of which is to raise more money for research in biostasis and cryonics. Because you look at the amount of funding, it's ludicrously small. Some organizations have billionaire members, and yet they don't put any money into this. It seems to be madness. I know people over 90 years old who have hundreds of millions of dollars who are not giving anything. To me, that's absolutely insane. There's no downside at that point to putting a few tens of millions into this research. Because it does depend on the cost to you. If you start fairly early with life insurance, then it's usually pretty affordable. If you wait till later, it could be a difficult expense. It does cost a fair bit. So I understand that reason. You want to have some positive upside. You've got to multiply really the probability you think it will work with the outcome if it does, plus what do you think is the probability that we won't really need biostasis. And on that latter point, I argue that we should be a little bit cautious about thinking that solving the aging problem is just around the corner, because we've been saying that for many decades now. Researching into that, you can go back way back. Robert Anton Wilson in 1978 wrote an article in Future Life magazine where he basically set out the longevity escape velocity idea and quoted various other people saying we're going to solve the aging problem in the next few years or by the end of the century, 2000. Even Roy Walford, who's a very sober fellow, was saying long before now he thought we'd solve this problem. Obviously, we're getting better at the science. There's the possibility that AI will speed up the progress, and I certainly hope that's the case, and it looks promising in certain areas, not yet in the life extension field. But how long will it take? I have no idea, and at 60 years old, I'm not willing to take that bet without having a backup plan. So to me, I think of cryonics as plan A. My analogy is kind of like financial planning. When you're creating a portfolio, the very first thing you're advised to do is have an emergency fund. Before you get speculative investments, which could be various life extension treatments, you do the things that will work, exercise and diet, of course, but put in place something that you could need, even if we solve the problem of aging. There's still diseases that won't be immediately curable. There's still accidents that kill people. There are people who like to go on adventures, climb mountains and so on. There'll still be a role for it anyway. So get that in place if you can afford to do it. It's not cheap, but it's not as expensive as many people think. To me, it's definitely worthwhile. I have to persuade you guys that the probability it's likely to work is higher than you may think right now. And given the future life that may open up the many thousands or more years of payback, I think it's a pretty good balance on the equation.
David, are you convinced? Are you going to stop cryocrastinating?
Sometime soon, yes.
Real soon, though.
Lord made me virtuous, but not yet.
Yeah, exactly.
At a recent conference in Panama, which the three of us were all at, you and David had a couple of spirited debates about whether new technologies should be evaluated and tested before being released. The idea that they should is the precautionary principle, and you advocated the alternative, which is that we should let rip and enjoy the benefits of new technologies as fast as humanly possible. And you've called this the proactionary principle. How would you summarize your side of that debate?
I would slightly push back against your characterizing. It's not really trying to do it as fast as humanly possible, because I don't think we should just ignore any risks or spend any amount of money to do this or force people to put 50% of GDP into it. So it's a little bit of an exaggeration. But definitely we should be staying out of the way for a number of reasons. One is that people talk about existential risk. And frankly, I think a lot of these extreme risk fantasies are just fantasies. They're really genie tales. You have a long history of people conjuring the genie or the demon and making a deal, and it always goes badly wrong. And it seems like we have that kind of view about AI. I don't really see some of the extreme scenarios as that plausible. There's a separate issue we could maybe go into. I think part of it is what's developed, especially among certain groups like the so-called rationalists in California, is a sort of inside view where they've formed a very strong internal set of ideas and ways of thinking about it that have reinforced their view that there's a drastic problem. And from the outside view, that seems a little bit crazy to me. It also looks very much like a lot of the other doomsaying we've seen on many other topics, like we talked about earlier on. There's so many different dooms that we've seen in the past that didn't occur. So, of course, they always say, well, it's different this time, and these various reasons, but I don't think it really is that different. But on the other side, what's not discussed so much is, apart from existential risks, there are what I call the existential opportunities of AI, which are enormous. If you block AI-driven progress in biomedical research, life extension, and many areas conducive to human well-being, you're basically stopping the solution to a lot of problems. You're stopping the reduction of suffering around the world. You're stopping the reduction of death. So in some sense, it's an existential threat if you don't allow AI, because one by one, we're going to be extinguished. It's the end for us individually, for our loved ones. That's a pretty huge, very real and obvious downside, not a speculative one. Again, not pushing at maximum speed, but I do want to remove unnecessary barriers. I think that a lot of the regulation that's being proposed is a supremely bad idea. We already have regulation. There's plenty of ways of regulating things. There's a lot of departments in the US that already have relevant regulations. And you've got also basic laws that apply as well to keep people responsible. I think some new rules may need to be in place, for instance, to deal with copyright issues. But if you compare in the USA how we dealt with the internet in the 1990s and the way we're dealing with AI, they're radically different approaches. With the internet, it was pretty much hands-off. And what happened? Well, it became a huge industry, and we can't imagine living without it. Whereas with AI, it's suddenly we've got to regulate this thing to death. Regulations tend to backfire, in my view, so there should be a strong presumption against them. Especially over time, regulations may not be so bad initially, but because of political and bureaucratic incentives, they keep growing. People have their own reasons for regulating things. Basically, you're saying we should trust politicians and bureaucrats. To me, the history doesn't suggest that's such a great idea. I think the problem with heavy regulation also is that it depends on a false view of foresight. It seems to be this view that you can sit back, think about the future, and you know what's going to happen, so you put in place the right rules that will deal with the problems. Well, just thinking about what happened with nuclear power here. We basically destroyed the nuclear power by over-regulating it. And again, the 1990s with the internet, where we didn't do that, because we can't imagine how that was going to develop. This started off as a simple protocol for some physicists at CERN to communicate some ideas, and became something incredible that you couldn't possibly imagine that ahead of time. Nobody really did. A few people had a vague inkling of it. It's not that you can't do anything to reduce the risk. For instance, I think you could do things like don't connect powerful general-purpose AI systems to nuclear weapons, jet fighters, power stations, robot factories, or major financial systems. Maybe prefer narrow AI to general AI for that kind of thing. So favor more special-purpose AI. If you're using AI to run physical tools, make those systems physically isolated and run by narrow AI. Make sure that physical systems running the AI are visible and able to be shut down. Be reasonably transparent about how your AI works. All those things seem pretty reasonable. There should be a presumption in favor of allowing people to do things. There should be a sunsetting imperative where any new technology regulations imposed should include a provision for sunsetting, because politicians don't move very quickly. Regulators don't move quickly. The technology is moving very rapidly. It's kind of absurd to put in place a regulatory regime today and expect that to last long at all. It's going to be outdated. In fact, it'll probably be outdated before the law is even passed. A sunset provision would reduce that damage, and I think that applies more generally with the regulations. I think operators offering a similarly situated product or service should be regulated no more stringently than its least regulated competitor. One issue with regulation is that it's typically captured by the large companies. AI is already very expensive, although there's some signs it may be getting a bit less expensive in some ways. But the more regulation you have, the more difficult it is to comply with it. Smaller companies are just not going to be able to afford to do that. So you're going to tend to centralize the AI among fewer and fewer corporations that can afford to do this. So there'll be less accountable, there'll be less competition. So I think we need more an open ecosystem, which actually will be encouraged by more reasonable regulation. I agree with also David Brin that what we need for AI safety is not to restrict AI, but to actually encourage competing AIs that will keep an eye on each other, where they're distinct individuals that we can ID them just like we do with other technologies, and they can hold each other accountable, look for weaknesses and problems in each other. We know that kind of works from the checks and balances idea. There's no reason why that couldn't be applied to AI as well. This idea that we should have a single monolithic agency like in California that got a particularly bad approach to that. We don't need that. There's already things like NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technologies in the US, which already has an AI risk management framework. Why do we need a whole new agency to oversee everything? There are already agencies overseeing medical devices, educational institutions, transportation. There's federal and state consumer protection statutes and agencies already in place. There's already a huge amount of regulation. We don't need more. The number of agencies involved in AI regulation was 17 in 2022, increased to 21 in 2023. That's going to get worse under the Biden administration's executive order and the OMB directives. So for all those reasons, I'm deeply suspicious of the need for more regulation. I think there's quite enough as it is. It needs to be rationalized. Again, the example of Washington's hands-off approach in the 90s, I think, is quite educational.
I'm with you with a great deal on that. I think we have to understand the risks which do need attention. You had a nice list of them earlier, Max. You said we should avoid connecting AI systems that we don't fully understand to nuclear weapon systems or to fighter jets or to very central parts of our financial infrastructure and so on. I think that's where we should start off. Rather than starting by regulation, we should start with an understanding. We should accept that our understanding will evolve. We should avoid hardwiring things in ways that are inflexible. I look at the motor car industry as an interesting example. It started off with some very unfortunate regulation. It used to be that you'd have to have a man walking in front of the car with a red flag, partly because the industry of railways didn't fancy the competition, and so they were partially pushing back. And that was agreed after a while to be a mistake. But then more and more people were killed by motor cars. If you look at the death statistics, it went up and up and up for a while. And there were various kinds of regulations. There were consumer movements as well, like Mothers Against Drunk Driving. I think it was great that they managed to put into law some limits on what people could individually decide about how much alcohol they could consume before they got behind the vehicle. And then there was pushback against the use of leaded petrol. There was this effect, it seems to be there, that if there was too much leaded petrol, it had an adverse impact on health and possibly on IQ and possibly on criminality statistics. So thank goodness in due course there was some agreed regulations, and we have, as a result, reduced significantly the number of people who suffer the appalling catastrophe of being killed in a car crash. I think in the same way, we need to be flexible and thoughtful about what can go wrong with AI. And absolutely, we need to go as fast as we can on the AIs, which we have good reason will be safe and useful and can help us figure out more reliable ways of doing chronic preservation and reanimation, more reliable ways to figure out which biomedical interventions can undo aging. So I want to go as fast as possible, but I want it to be harnessed with an awareness that sometimes the things which we believe will be for good have terrible side effects. And there has been some bad side effects of the internet and smartphones. It has messed with the emotional state, the psychological well-being of many people, especially youngsters. I think it is appropriate to have a similar concern about what AI can do for fake news, what AI can do in destabilizing some of the democratic discourse, what AI might do in war situations. We are, on the whole, in a better situation than in the past, but people in Gaza, people in Ukraine will object. They'll say, in some ways, they're in a worse situation than before. And when you mix together AI and weaponry, especially if the AI can make mistakes, as some of the systems I've just mentioned in Gaza and in Ukraine, they make mistakes from time to time, we do need to be aware of it. So I think we need both the proactionary principle to realize that doing nothing is dangerous and doing nothing is risky, and we should be learning from our interventions, but also the precautionary principle that says if there is a possibility of something truly bad happening, not just harm but ruin, then we should be exploring ways to reverse it if there are signs that that risk is becoming realized. So what I would like is more emphasis on differential development, the defensive capabilities, the monitoring as to what AI is actually doing. And you already said this, Max, you wish the AIs to be more transparent, more explicable. So we need to have more focus on that rather than just developing capabilities because the capabilities might help us.
You say we need both the precautionary principle and the precautionary principle. I would say no, we don't really, because the precautionary principle isn't quite where you stated it. It tends to have an inherent bias. It's very one-sided, in other words. The precautionary principle is not just go, go, go. It actually says we should look at the upsides and the downsides. We should treat natural and human risks the same way, and many other provisions like that. So it's not just throw aside everything and run forward. It's a bit more cautious than that. But it tries to be balanced, whereas the precautionary principle really doesn't. The way it was initially brought about was specifically to basically block progress, and that's how it's being used. So I think the precautionary principle can handle those two things. Just to comment on a couple of the cases you mentioned, drunk driving. Well, I have no problem with having laws against drunk driving, but to me that's not regulation. Maybe this is a point to just clarify, because people say I'm against all regulation. Well, it depends on how you define regulation. I think there are laws, universally applicable laws that can be applied to particular cases, like laws against fraud that can apply in many different situations, liability laws and so on. So something like drunk driving, you're clearly putting people in harm. It's the same way that if you were to walk around the street with a malfunctioning flamethrower, that shouldn't be illegal either, unless you're on someone's private property and they've allowed you to do that. So I think that's not a problem. I don't really call that regulation. I call that reasonable application of law. Lead in gasoline would also be another case where if you've proven a clear link, which as far as I know there really is a clear link between lead and the problems you mentioned, then that's an externality which might be difficult to deal with other than by a law. So that kind of thing I think is fine. But again, I don't really think of that as regulation. I think of regulations as being where you set up agencies to focus on one industry and have certain people telling people in detail how they do things rather than applying general laws. So just to clarify that, again, it's not just a matter of doing nothing. I'm in favor of applying general laws that are harder to abuse. They can still be abused, but are more difficult. One interesting issue is self-driving cars driven by AI, because there we have the question, well, are they perfect? Well, no, they're not. It's going to be very hard to perfect things. We've reached pretty good self-driving levels, but they're still not quite perfect. So what do we do about that? We can either say, well, apply a precautionary principle and say, well, we just can't do it at all. Or we can say, well, maybe there's some level of imperfection we can tolerate because humans aren't perfect either. We may be imperfect in different ways, but if self-driving cars could actually massively eliminate accidents, they will kill a few people who may not be killed by humans or may, but they will save many more lives. Then we have a tricky issue of, do we go ahead with this thing? So obviously we can't compare a perfect situation with an imperfect situation. You have to compare the actual outcomes and then make decisions. So that's a very tricky case in the case of self-driving. We tend to expect a lot more of the machines than we do of the humans. We treat them differently, maybe for some good reason. But that's definitely a kind of a tricky case.
One question about agencies. Max, you say you're worried that agencies being set up to monitor individual industries. What about, for example, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA? Now, they've made some mistakes, clearly, in terms of the monitoring of some of the new airlines that they allowed to come to the market, which weren't completely safe. But are you saying that the agency shouldn't exist, or that simply that there are dangers in any such agency?
Well, when we think of those things, it's difficult to really imagine what it'd be like in a different system because we don't have that different system, and pretty much all countries have moved in this direction. So what would it be like if we didn't have an FAA? If we just had strict liability, for instance? There would certainly be agencies kind of like the FAA, maybe voluntary bodies, industry bodies that offer principles that should reduce risk. And if you don't follow those and then something goes badly wrong, you're massively liable. There you've got sort of the benefits of allowing people to do things but having to pay their own costs. It's very important they do pay those costs. So I'm not convinced actually you need an agency more than an advisory agency. Same with the FDA, which probably saved some lives, but I think it's caused a lot more damage than it's done good. If that was a voluntary agency that made its suggestions, that would be one thing. And of course, we have lots of private groups that issue advisories and their own kinds of nutrition labels, that kind of thing. But once you start imposing these things and putting bureaucrats in charge, they don't have to bear the cost of the rules themselves. All their incentive is on preventing problems, and they don't have any incentive to look on the benefit side. They get in big trouble if they pass a drug that causes a problem. They get in massive trouble. Imagine being the guy who approved thalidomide. It's going to ruin your life. Whereas on the other side, if allowing a drug shortens illnesses and saves lives, what benefit do you get as a regulator? None. So you're entirely biased against them. That's why I prefer a system of responsibility and liability that can balance the two more effectively.
So unfortunately, we're running out of time. Max, can you tell us a bit about what your future plans involve? I know you're writing a book. What else are you up to?
Yeah, I'm writing a book on cryonics because when people ask me for a book, I say, well, there isn't really anything suitable. There's Ettinger's book from 1964. There isn't really a current book I can point to that does the job. So I thought I have to write it. I have the experience, and I've been involved with this for 40 years or so. I know the technology, I know the organizational stuff and the history. So it's really a book intended to inform a general interested reader who doesn't really have much background in the area, to actually look at how it actually works in practice as opposed to fantasy, what the technology is, what the possibilities are, the organizational challenges, how do we keep organizations going long enough, how do we make sure that the funding is good to keep patients in place for decades. Lots of different legal, technological, cultural issues to deal with. In the context of life extension being a good thing, but I'm going to be adding something more positive on that in the book to make the case for the longevity dividend and so on. So it's within the context of that. So that's a pretty important thing for the present. I also write on my own blog, Extropic Thoughts, where I deal with a lot of these issues. I write for Biostasis Technologies blog on cryonics at least once a month. And I'm also involved in trying to improve standards in the biostasis or cryonics industry. There's a lot of different organizations, new ones popping up. I think it's very important to hold them to account, make sure they keep improving, make sure that they are actually pushing new technologies, doing research and implementing the research. Although I've spent 10 years running Alcor and a couple more years doing communications for it, I am not really happy with its current direction or recent direction. It seems to be increasingly risk-averse. It's not trying any new skills. Tomorrow Biostasis in Europe is actually way ahead these days. It's doing things that Alcor is not willing to do, which I think are things that are good things to do. And I know some ideas have been thought about by Alcor for a long time, but don't get implemented. One easy example is the CT scanning, which I mentioned earlier, which is a really good thing to do as a quality check. That was something I started back in 2011 or so. And Alcor bought a CT scanner several years ago, did a couple of scans, it stopped working. They got a new one, they had to upgrade the electrical system. Years have passed since that new one came in. There have been no CT scans, not even taking them to the local Scottsdale Medical Imaging Lab where we used to go before we had a CT scanner. So it's kind of going backwards in that area. I think there are too many lawyers, frankly, on the board of directors as the CEOs. They're very risk averse. So these days I actually look to Tomorrow Biostasis as the innovator. So what we're doing is not specifically to favor an organization, but to improve standards in general, promote research, and get things moving better, to help people understand how this can work and to make it more compelling. So that's really kind of the goal, keep moving the industry forward. You mentioned Alcor's membership numbers, which are, the largest there are. Actually, it's more like 1,600 than 2,000, I think, but that's pretty pathetic. After over 50 years of growth, it's tiny. So we need better public communications. It's a very difficult thing to communicate. Not being willing to communicate because you think it's risky or make it a bad story is not the way to do it, which is currently Alcor's policy. So a lot of my job is communication, trying to get the idea across, trying to get it to be clear and compelling. And that's really what I'll be doing for foreseeable future. But on my own blog, I kind of explore wider issues to do with technology as well, including obviously AI, other such issues.
Do you know when the book is likely to appear?
I have no idea, because at this point I've stopped writing the book and I'm working on a book proposal. First real proposal I've written, actually, although I had a book almost published before. It's actually really tough, as I found, to write a really good proposal. I'm currently trying to write very concise chapter summaries. Then you have to do a very concise cover letter to get the agent. Then the agent has to get a publisher. And I also look at very pessimistic numbers that 2% of letters to agents even get read. It's a little bit depressing. But I'm going to try and get an agent and a publisher. If not, I'll self-publish, and that obviously would be faster.
Yeah, you could just dispense with all that proposals and agents if you do self-publishing, and that's really quite easy these days.
I'm kind of inclined to do that simply because even if you get a good publisher and a good agent, that doesn't mean anything necessarily. Most books, other than ones they expect to be bestsellers, don't get pushed by publishers anymore. There's no budget for marketing.
That's true. They expect you to do the marketing as well, and it takes a year to publish, and you don't get to choose your own cover. There is an advantage in being published by a mainstream publisher, which is that you can get reviewed by mainstream media. The mainstream media tend not to review self-published books, and it's also very hard for self-published people to get into bookstores. It can be done, but it's tough. But those are pretty much the only advantages. Anyway, look, we've probably detained you for far too long, Max. It's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you very much indeed for joining the London Futurist podcast.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. You two guys always ask great questions, and we're enough together in our thinking that it makes it very productive.
And Max, once your book is released, we'd love to have you come back and tell us what you've discovered while writing it.
That would be great.
And maybe give some hint about publishing as well, because there are lots of people who have the same questions as you about how on earth do they get an agent to pay attention.
All right, I look forward to it.
Thanks.
Thank you.